The room was already quiet before anyone noticed why. Crystal glasses hovered midair, a fork paused halfway to a plate, and beneath the low amber glow of a private dining chandelier, every eye slowly turned toward the same corner of the table. Ava Johnson stood there, perfectly still, a silver tray balanced in her hands, her posture straight, but her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge, the only sign that she felt the shift in the air. Across from her, Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the leather, the other tapping once against the rim of his glass, his lips curling into a thin, amused smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He tilted his head, studying her like she was a misplaced detail in a room designed for precision. "Say that again," he said, slower this time, each word deliberate, his voice cutting clean through the silence. A couple of guests let out soft, restrained chuckles, the kind that didn't belong to humor but to alignment, to knowing where power sat at the table. Ava didn't move. Her gaze remained steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present, as if she had learned long ago how to exist in rooms where she wasn't expected to be seen. The faint hum of the city outside pressed softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, 27 stories above the street, where traffic lights blinked like distant signals no one inside had to obey. Richard leaned forward now, elbows brushing the table, his tone sharpening just enough to draw blood without raising his voice. "Or is that too complicated for you?" The word hung there, unspoken but understood, and the tension in the room tightened like a wire pulled just a little too far. Ava inhaled slowly, the fabric of her uniform shifting with the movement, her shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm so controlled it almost felt rehearsed. Somewhere behind her, a glass clinked softly against another, the sound too loud for the silence it interrupted. No one stepped in. No one ever did in moments like this. And yet, something had already changed. It wasn't loud, not visible, not something you could point to, but it was there, sitting just beneath the surface like a current waiting to break through. If you've ever been in a moment like this, where everything pauses and you can feel something bigger about to happen, take a second right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next, because stories like this, they don't end the way you expect. And while you're here, tell me, what time is it where you're watching from, and what city or country are you in? I always wonder who's sitting in moments like this with me. Back at the table, Richard's smile lingered, confident, certain, built on years of never being questioned, never being wrong in rooms like this. Ava finally shifted her weight, just slightly, the tray lowering by half an inch as her eyes moved. Not away, but directly to him, calm, focused, unshaken. The air seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time that night, the silence didn't belong to him anymore. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, the kind that settled into the chest and made every breath feel louder than it should be. And in that space, Ava Johnson became aware of everything at once. The faint scent of citrus from the polished table, the soft hum of the ventilation above, the weight of eyes that had already decided who she was before she ever spoke a word, and yet none of it pulled her backward. None of it made her shrink, because this was not the first time. She had stood in a room that tried to make her feel smaller than she was. Not the first time her presence had been reduced to a uniform and a role that erased everything else about her. And somewhere deep beneath the calm surface of her expression lived a different version of her life. One that did not belong to trays and quiet footsteps and carefully measured politeness. One built in late nights and borrowed textbooks. In library corners where the air smelled like paper and determination. Where she had once traced foreign alphabets with her finger until the shapes stopped looking unfamiliar and started sounding like meaning. Where language was not decoration but power, not performance but precision, and she had held on to that even when everything else had shifted, even when her mother's medical bills stacked higher than her savings, even when the scholarship letters stopped coming and reality replaced possibility with responsibility. And so she learned to move differently, to speak less, to observe more, to let people underestimate her because it was easier than explaining herself to those who had already decided she did not belong. And now, standing in a room lined with glass and wealth and quiet arrogance, she could feel that same pattern unfolding again, the assumption settling over her like a label she had never agreed to wear, and across the table Richard Whitmore watched her with a kind of detached certainty, the kind that came from a lifetime of being right simply because no one had ever challenged him long enough to prove otherwise. His fingers tapping once more against the glass, slower now, as if he was waiting for her to fill the silence in a way that confirmed what he already believed, that she would apologize, step back, disappear into the background where she belonged in his version of the world. But Ava did not move, not in the way he expected. Instead, her eyes shifted briefly, just enough to take in the rest of the table, the guests who avoided looking directly at her. The man seated 2 chairs down who had been speaking earlier in a language most of the room did not understand, his posture composed, observant, his attention sharper than the others, and for a brief moment their gazes almost aligned before she returned her focus forward, her breath steady, her mind clear, because what she had heard moments ago had not been casual conversation. It had not been harmless or irrelevant. It had been precise, intentional, layered in a way that most people in the room would never notice. And that realization sat quietly beneath everything else, heavier than the insult, more important than the tension, like a thread waiting to be pulled. And still she said nothing, not yet, because timing mattered, because words without the right moment lost their weight. And the room, still suspended in expectation, had not yet reached the point where it was ready to hear her. Richard Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, not enough to signal discomfort, but just enough to reveal that the silence had lasted longer than he intended. And in a room where he controlled timing, attention, and outcome, even a few extra seconds felt like something slipping out of place, his gaze narrowing as he studied Ava again, this time with less amusement and more calculation, as if trying to reconcile the quiet stillness in front of him with the reaction he expected to provoke. Because in his world, people responded quickly. They apologized. They corrected themselves. They folded under pressure in ways that reassured him of his position. But she had not done any of that, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. So he leaned back once more, reclaiming the space with a slow exhale, letting his voice return with a measured calm that carried more weight than before, asking her to repeat what she had said earlier about the order, about the detail she had corrected, as if giving her a second chance to step back into the role he had assigned her. But Ava did not rush to answer, her movements deliberate as she adjusted the tray in her hands, the metal catching a faint reflection of the chandelier light, her posture unchanged, grounded, as though she was standing on something deeper than the polished floor beneath her. And across the table the man who had spoken earlier in Arabic remained quiet, his fingers loosely interlocked, his attention no longer drifting but fixed now, attentive in a way that suggested he had begun to notice the same shift that had unsettled Richard. Because moments like this were not unfamiliar to him either, rooms where language carried layers, where meaning lived beneath tone and phrasing, where the wrong interpretation could cost more than pride. And as Richard began to speak again, referencing the upcoming agreement, the partnership, that would expand his influence across markets he barely understood but fully intended to dominate, Ava listened, not to the words themselves, but to the structure beneath them, the subtle alignment between what had been said in English and what had been implied earlier in Arabic. And the difference was not small. It was not harmless. It was the kind of difference that rewrote responsibility, that shifted risk from one side of the table to the other without ever stating it directly, and she felt it settle into place in her mind with the clarity of something she had studied before, something she had once broken down line by line in a classroom that felt a lifetime away. And for a brief moment her grip on the tray tightened again, not from fear, but from recognition, because now the moment was no longer about her, no longer about the insult or the tension or the expectation pressing down on her shoulders. It was about what was about to happen if no one said anything, about the quiet certainty that everyone in the room was walking toward an outcome they did not fully see. And still no one spoke, not the advisors, not the assistants, not the executives seated along the table who nodded along with confidence built on partial understanding. And Richard continued, his tone steady, assured, already imagining the signature that would close the deal, unaware that the foundation beneath it had already begun to crack in a way he could not yet see. And Ava, standing just outside the circle of power but seeing more clearly than anyone inside it, finally shifted her gaze back to him, the decision forming not as a reaction, but as something inevitable, something that had been building from the moment she first heard the words spoken in a language the room assumed she would never understand. The decision did not arrive with urgency. It settled into her like something that had already been made long before this moment. And when Ava Johnson finally moved, it was small, almost unnoticeable at first, a subtle shift of her weight, the tray lowering gently onto the edge of the service stand beside her, the soft metal contact barely audible, yet somehow louder than anything that had been said in the last few minutes. And that single movement drew attention in a way silence alone could not. A quiet signal that something was about to change, and across the table Richard Whitmore paused mid-sentence, his voice trailing off just enough to acknowledge the interruption without fully conceding control, his eyes narrowing again, sharper now, less amused, more alert, as if he sensed that the moment he had been shaping was no longer entirely his to command, and still the room held its breath, waiting, because even those who did not understand what was happening could feel that the balance had shifted, that the air itself carried a different weight, and Ava did not rush to fill it. She let the stillness stretch 1 second longer, 2, just enough to ensure that when she spoke, it would not be ignored, and when her voice finally came, it was calm, measured, steady in a way that did not ask for permission. "Sir," she said. Her tone respectful but firm, the kind that carried clarity without hesitation. The phrasing you just agreed to does not match what was stated earlier. And a faint ripple moved through the table, subtle, uncertain, the kind of reaction people give when something sounds wrong but they are not yet sure why. And Richard's expression hardened instantly, the shift immediate, his posture straightening as if reclaiming authority through presence alone. "You are out of line," he replied, his voice low, controlled, each word placed carefully, not loud enough to cause a scene, but sharp enough to draw a boundary, a reminder of where she stood and where she did not belong. And a few of the guests nodded faintly, their silence aligning once again with him, reinforcing the structure that had existed before she spoke. But Ava did not step back. She did not apologize. Instead, her gaze moved briefly toward the man seated 2 chairs down, the one who had spoken in Arabic earlier, and then back to Richard, her expression unchanged, composed, grounded. The Arabic version includes a conditional override. She continued, her voice just as even as before, and for the first time the room reacted in a way that could not be dismissed, not laughter, not discomfort, but attention, real attention, because now the words carried something specific, something measurable, and Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest indication that the conversation had moved into territory he had not anticipated. "That is not relevant," he said quickly, dismissing it with a flick of his hand. But the confidence behind the gesture did not land the same way it had moments ago, because uncertainty had already entered the room, and Ava, still standing where she had been from the beginning, did not raise her voice, did not change her tone. She simply took one more step forward into the space between roles and expectations. And when she spoke again, she did not switch back to English. The words flowed instead in precise, fluent Arabic, clear and unmistakable, not rehearsed, not hesitant, but exact, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, the kind of silence that does not come from tension, but from recognition. As the man across the table slowly leaned forward, his expression shifting from polite distance to focused attention, and in that moment, without raising her voice, without breaking her composure, Ava had done something no one in the room expected. She had changed who was being listened to. The words did not echo, they settled, precise and deliberate, each syllable in Arabic landing with a clarity that did not belong to hesitation or guesswork, and the effect moved through the room in a way no raised voice ever could, subtle but undeniable, like a shift in gravity that everyone felt at once, but no one immediately acknowledged. And the man across the table, whose attention had been measured and distant until now, leaned forward slowly, his fingers uncurling from their relaxed position, his posture sharpening as he listened not just to the language, but to the meaning beneath it, because what Ava had said was not casual, it was exact, it pointed to structure, to intention, to a clause that changed more than wording, it changed responsibility, and his eyes flicked briefly toward Richard Whitmore before returning to her, studying her with a new kind of focus. one that replaced assumption with evaluation. And in that moment, the room divided itself quietly, those who still clung to Richard's authority and those who were beginning to question it. And Richard felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle withdrawal of certainty from the space he controlled, the way attention was no longer anchored to him alone, and it pressed against him in a way he was not accustomed to, not loud, not confrontational, but persistent, and he responded the only way he knew how, by tightening his control, his voice cutting back in, sharper now, less patient. "That is enough," he said, the words firm, designed to close the moment before it could expand any further. But the authority behind them did not land the same way it had before, because the room had already heard something it could not unhear, and Ava, still composed, still steady, did not react to the interruption as a challenge. She simply finished what she had begun, her tone unchanged, continuing in Arabic, clarifying the implication, the conditional phrasing that allowed one side to shift liability after. The agreement was signed, a detail buried deep enough to be overlooked, but significant enough to reshape the entire outcome. And this time the reaction was not silence. It was movement, subtle at first, a glance exchanged between two executives, a hand reaching for a document, the faint rustle of paper against polished wood, and the man across the table spoke, his voice calm but unmistakably engaged, responding to her in the same language, his words slower, deliberate, testing, confirming, and Ava answered without pause, matching his precision, her voice steady, grounded in understanding rather than performance, and for a brief moment the rest of the room ceased to exist. The conversation narrowing to clarity between two people who understood exactly what was being said, while everyone else watched the shift unfold in real time. And Richard's expression changed again, not dramatically, not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough to reveal that something had slipped beyond his control, his jaw tightening, his fingers pressing lightly against the table as if anchoring himself to something solid, and the confidence that had filled the room earlier began to thin, replaced by something less certain, something questioning. And when the man across the table finally leaned back again, his gaze lingering on Ava for a fraction longer before turning to Richard, the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was charged with recognition, with the quiet understanding that the conversation had changed direction, and that the person who had been dismissed moments ago now held the piece of information no one else had seen. And Ava, standing exactly where she had been from the beginning, did not look triumphant, did not seek acknowledgement. She simply held her ground, calm and unwavering, as the weight of what she had revealed settled fully into the room. For a moment, nothing moved, not the glasses, not the hands resting on the table, not even the quiet rhythm of shifting posture that usually filled spaces like this, because the room had entered a different kind of silence now, one that did not belong to tension or anticipation, but to realization, and it settled slowly, like light filtering through a space that had been closed off, revealing details that had always been there, but never truly seen. And Ava Johnson felt it without looking, the way the air had changed around her, the way the attention no longer pressed down on her as judgment, but hovered instead as awareness. And still she did not move, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her presence grounded in a way that did not seek to hold the moment, but simply allowed it to exist. And across from her, Richard Whitmore remained still, his expression controlled but no longer effortless, the certainty that had once defined his posture now replaced by something quieter, something more restrained, as if he was recalibrating in real time, adjusting to a reality that did not align with the assumptions he had carried into the room. And his gaze dropped briefly to the documents in front of him, the pages that had seemed so straightforward moments ago, now carrying a different weight. The lines no longer just formalities but potential consequences, and one of the executives beside him shifted, pulling the document closer, scanning it again with a focus that had not been there before, his brow tightening slightly as he traced the section Ava had referenced, and the faint sound of paper moving broke the stillness just enough to confirm what everyone was beginning to understand, that something had been missed, something important, and the man across the table, who had engaged with Ava in Arabic moments earlier, leaned back slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the arm of his chair, his gaze steady as he observed the shift unfold, not with urgency, not with pressure, but with the quiet patience of someone who knew the outcome no longer depended on persuasion, and the room, once aligned in a single direction, now felt divided in thought. Each person processing the same information at a different pace, some catching up, some reconsidering, some quietly stepping back from the confidence they had held before. And through it all, Ava remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, her role unchanged in appearance yet entirely different in presence. And in that stillness, there was something unmistakable, not triumph, not defiance, but clarity, the kind that did not need to be announced because it was already understood. And Richard finally exhaled, slow and measured, his hand resting flat against the table as if grounding himself, before speaking again. But when he did, his voice carried a different tone, not weaker, not uncertain, but altered, shaped by the awareness that the room had seen something he had not. And for the first time that evening, the silence that followed his words did not belong to his control. It belonged to the truth that had quietly taken its place at the center of the table, and no one moved to dismiss it. Richard Whitmore did not speak immediately, and that alone carried more weight than anything he could have said, because a man like him was never silent without intention. Yet this pause was different. It was not calculated, not designed to control the room. It was the kind that came when certainty had been interrupted and had not yet found its way back, and his eyes remained on the document in front of him, scanning the lines again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if reading something that had changed, without the ink ever moving. And beside him one of his advisors leaned in slightly, pointing to a section with a restrained urgency, whispering just low enough to avoid drawing attention, but not low enough to hide the shift in tone. And across the table the man who had engaged with Ava watched quietly, his expression composed but no longer distant, his presence now anchored in the conversation in a way that subtly rebalanced the room. And when he finally spoke, it was not to Ava, but to Richard, his voice calm, measured, carrying a quiet authority that did not need to be asserted, asking a simple question in English this time, one that did not accuse but did not allow avoidance either, requesting clarification on the clause Ava had identified. And the room responded to that question differently than it had responded to anything before, because now it was not coming from someone expected to remain silent. It was coming from someone whose position could not be dismissed, and Richard lifted his gaze slowly, meeting the man's eyes. And for a brief moment the tension between them settled into something almost invisible but deeply present, a recognition that the dynamic had shifted, that the conversation no longer moved in a single direction. And Richard's answer came carefully, controlled, but lacking the effortless confidence it had carried earlier, as he explained the clause in general terms, attempting to frame it as standard, as procedural, as something that did not require concern. But even as he spoke, the words felt thinner, less anchored, because the room was no longer accepting explanations at face value. It was listening differently now, and the man across the table did not interrupt. He simply nodded once, slowly, then turned his attention back to Ava, not as a gesture of defiance, but as an acknowledgement of where the clarity had come from. And that small shift, that redirection of attention, carried through the room like a quiet ripple. And suddenly Ava was no longer standing at the edge of the moment. She was at its center, not by position, not by title, but by truth, and Richard felt it. The loss of control not in a dramatic collapse, but in a gradual rebalancing, where authority was no longer assumed but measured. And he exhaled again, slower this time, his hand lifting slightly from the table before settling back down, as if letting go of something he had been holding too tightly. And when he spoke again, his voice was different, not weakened, but adjusted, grounded in the awareness that the room had seen what he had missed. "Walk me through it," he said, not to his advisors, not to the executives beside him, but to Ava. And the words landed with a quiet finality, not as a concession, but as a recognition. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without stepping beyond her place, Ava had done something far more powerful than proving him wrong. She had changed who he was willing to listen to. Ava did not step closer. She did not reach for the document. She did not change her posture to match the shift in attention that now rested on her. She simply spoke, her voice calm and measured, the same steady tone she had carried from the beginning. as if nothing about the moment required her to become anything other than what she already was. And she began by pointing, not with her hand, but with her words, guiding the room through the structure of the clause, explaining how the phrasing in Arabic created a conditional pathway that allowed responsibility to be reassigned after the agreement was executed, not explicitly, not in a way that would raise immediate concern, but subtly, buried beneath formal language that most would read without question. And as she spoke, the executives leaned in, their attention no longer divided, their focus sharpened by the clarity she provided. And the sound of pages turning grew more frequent now, deliberate, synchronized, as if the entire table was catching up to a truth that had already settled in her mind minutes ago. And Richard Whitmore listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the document, following her explanation line by line. And for the first time that evening, he did not attempt to redirect, did not attempt to frame the narrative in his favor. He simply absorbed it. And the shift was not loud, not dramatic, but it was unmistakable, because the man who had controlled the room through certainty was now listening through understanding. And when Ava paused, not for effect, but because she had said everything that needed to be said, the silence that followed was different from all the others that had come before it. It was not tension, not anticipation, it was acknowledgement. And the man across the table gave a slow nod, his expression thoughtful, then turned slightly toward Richard, his voice calm as he confirmed what Ava had outlined, reinforcing it not as a challenge but as a fact. And that confirmation settled the matter in a way nothing else could have, because it came from within the circle of power itself. And Richard exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering just enough to reveal the release of resistance. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight, not diminished, but grounded. "We will need to revise this," he said, the words simple, direct, and the room responded immediately, not with applause, not with reaction, but with movement, advisors reaching for notes, assistants preparing to adjust the agreement, the entire structure of the meeting realigning itself around a new understanding. And through it all, Ava remained where she had always been, standing beside the service stand, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, her presence calm, unassuming, as if she had not just shifted the course of a multi-million-dollar decision. And Richard's gaze lifted from the document to her, just for a moment, and there was something in that look that had not been there before, not superiority, not dismissal, but recognition, quiet and unspoken. And Ava met it without hesitation, without reaction, simply holding the moment as it passed between them. And then, just as calmly as she had stepped into the conversation, she stepped back out of it, her role returning on the surface to what it had been before. But the room, the table, and the man at its center would not see her the same way again. The room did not return to what it had been, even as the conversation resumed, even as the advisors adjusted language, and the quiet rhythm of business filled the space again. Something had shifted too deeply to be undone, and Ava Johnson felt it in the way no one rushed her now, in the way no one spoke over her presence as if she were invisible. And yet she did not linger in that change. She did not hold on to it or look for acknowledgement. Instead, she reached for the tray once more, her fingers steady, her movements as precise as they had always been. And she stepped back into the role the room had first assigned her, not because she had to, but because she chose to. And that choice carried a quiet strength that did not need to be announced. And as she moved along the edge of the table, the soft reflection of the chandelier followed her across the polished floor, stretching and shifting with each step, a silent echo of the moment that had just passed. And behind her, Richard Whitmore remained seated, his gaze lingering for a fraction longer than necessary before returning to the documents in front of him. But this time his focus was different, sharper, grounded, shaped by something he had not expected to learn that evening. And though no apology was spoken, no formal acknowledgement made, the absence of dismissal itself carried meaning, the absence of that earlier certainty revealing more than words could have. And the man across the table resumed the discussion with a tone that now included Ava's insight as part of the foundation rather than an interruption. And the meeting continued, but not in the same direction it had begun. And as Ava reached the doorway, she paused for just a second, not to look back, not to claim the moment, but simply to breathe, the quiet air of the hallway meeting her with a stillness that felt different from the room she had just left. and then she stepped forward, the sound of her footsteps soft against the marble, fading gradually as distance replaced presence. And in that silence, there was something complete. Not a victory that needed to be celebrated, not a confrontation that needed to be remembered, but a balance restored in a way only actions, not words, could achieve. And if you have ever believed that being underestimated defines your limits, this moment reminds you that it does not, that strength does not always arrive loudly. And if this story stayed with you even for a second, take that as your sign to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because stories like this are not just told, they are felt. And somewhere out there, in another room, in another moment, someone just like Ava is about to be seen in a way no one expected. And as the door closed behind her, the reflection of light faded, leaving only the quiet presence of a truth that no one in that room would forget. If this story stayed with you, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications. In the next video, I will talk about the story, Play This Piano, I'll Marry You. Billionaire mocked black janitor until he played like Mozart. See you in the next video. Thank you for watching.